Hi, I'm Steve Latham with the Yale Interdisciplinary Center for Bioethics, and I'm speaking today with Dr. Evie Marcolini. Welcome.
Hi, Steve.
Hi. So I'm going to start off, I ask everybody the same thing. So tell me a little bit about your educational background.
My education started, my medical education. I did medical school in Vermont, at the University of Vermont, and then residency at Maine Medical Center in Portland, Maine, during which I found that I was interested in critical care. So I went to Baltimore and did a surgical critical care fellowship at shock trauma and stayed there as an attending for a couple of years and migrated back north and ended up here at Yale, where I worked for 8 years doing both emergency medicine and surgical critical care and then neurocritical care. And during my time here at Yale, got very involved with the ethics committee.
So what sort of thing did you do with the ethics committee?
Well, I was always very interested in it. So
This is the ethics committee of Yale New Haven Hospital.
Yes. So I lobbied to get on the committee, and at the first opportunity, they let me on. And I say that I worked on the committee as much to learn more about ethics as to give back to the hospital and work and do ethics consults. And I did some fun things. I gave some talks. I said to Mark Mercurio, I don't really know much about the principles of bioethics besides what I learned in medical school. And he said, well, why don't you give a talk on it? I said, okay, I'll give a talk on it. And it was a great experience because there's no better way to learn about something than to put together a talk. I also met Lori Bruce, who has become a very close friend and a mentor of mine. And she said, why don't you go to the Harvard Bioethics workshop, which I did, which was a great experience and gave me that much more background in ethics.
Mm-hmm.
And over the years, I've just taken any chance that I can to become involved in ethics. I'm part of the Society for Critical Care Medicine, and I'm on the ethics committee there, and have been involved in helping to write a book, and we're working on the next version of that book in general bioethics, and worked on some cases that we published in the journal.
Great. And you've been teaching the summer program for a couple of years.
I've been teaching since 2013.
Wow, okay.
Yeah.
Wow, 5 years.
Yeah.
And I assume that started because of Lori Bruce.
It was all Lori.
So,
yeah.
What have you taught in the summer program?
She and I started team teaching the neuroscience ethics, and that was a lot of fun. And eventually, she asked if I would take on the ethics of emergency medicine because the instructor for that moved, and she said it was open. I said that would be great because my clinical practice is half emergency medicine and half neurocritical care. So I got the best of both worlds. I get to teach both emergency medicine ethics and ethics of neuroscience. So
just so the audience gets a little bit better understanding, what are some issues that arise in each of those areas, in ethics of neuroscience and critical care and emergency medicine?
So with ethics of emergency medicine, it's fun. We start off with a classroom of people that most people don't know what emergency medicine is like, what we have to do on a day-to-day basis. So we talk about issues such as what do you do with the patient who comes in cardiac arrest, and should you allow the family to come into the resuscitation room while you're resuscitating the patient, while you're doing CPR and starting lines and doing all kinds of things. And we get great conversations going as to what people think about how we should treat that issue, because people are not only working in this society, but they're coming from all over the world, and you get a view from everywhere. And we talk about the ethics of triage. We do actually, every year what we've done is a mass casualty simulation. And this was started by Dr. Tom Roby, who actually taught the class before I did,
Mm-hmm.
and it is the best. People have so much fun with it because we put people in teams and we simulate a mass casualty, and they have to decide what happens with the patients who keep rolling into their scenario.
Mm-hmm.
And so they have multiple patients, more than they can handle, and they have to decide, are we sending this patient to the hospital, or are we keeping this patient here? Are we going to resuscitate this patient or not? And it puts you in the situation of I've got to make these decisions, and I have to make them fast. So I don't have time to think about the ethics of all of this. I just need to do it. So that's the brilliance of emergency medicine, is making ethical decisions in a fast-paced environment. And then when we talk about the ethics of neuroscience, it's twofold. It's the science of neuroethics. So we talk about fMRI and the technology that we use now in the name of neuroscience, and how does that apply to, how are we using it in the legal world? How are we using it in the recreational world? And the neuroscience of that. And then we talk about the ethics of neuroscience. And that means, how are we doing the research, and what is ethical? How do we research on patients who maybe don't have the capacity to have full consent? So we get into some really good conversations. Today we had a great conversation on neuroscience and the law. How are we using fMRI in the case of people who have committed crimes? And how is that information used to influence a jury? Is it appropriate or not? Should we legislate it? Should we govern it? Should we have a say in it?
Yeah, I know fMRI has been used in defense in death penalty cases to try to prove that the defendant couldn't have done anything else, right? Kind of an anti-free will case being made with fMRI images.
Exactly.
And I remember we have a colleague at the law school here who teaches a course on visual persuasion in the law, which is about how you show things to jurors to persuade them. Things like photographic evidence, 3D exhibits, models, all these kinds of things. And one of the things that they grapple with is the fMRI image. Because normally, for example, when you introduce a photo in evidence, you say, is this a fair and accurate representation of the scene of the crime? That's the magic words, and the person has to say, yes, that's a fair and accurate representation of the scene of the crime. Well, is this cross-section of a brain with bits of it glowing red a fair and accurate representation of anything? No, it is not.
Yeah.
So how do you talk about that to a jury? How do you get that in as evidence? What is it really showing them?
Yeah.
It's just amazing.
It is amazing,
fascinating.
and it's a great conversation because there's so many different rabbit holes you can go down with that. And one of the other things we do in the neuro class is take a visit to the Cushing Brain Center, where we see the exhibit of the brains that Dr. Cushing put together. It's an amazing exhibit. And Terry DeGrady, who has taken us through that tour every year, is an amazing tour guide. And she not only tells us about the brains and about how they got there, but she tells us about Dr. Cushing's life and some of the personal background. And then we have a conversation about that, about how do we look at using people's actual brains as an exhibit and consent for using that. And it takes us into all kinds of conversations about using brains for research, using bodies for research, using bodies for education and cadavers and all kinds of stuff. So it's interesting.
I have some issues with the way in which those brains are displayed. At least some parts of it. There are some of the brains are actually associated with articles and photographs of the people whose brains they are.
Yes.
And there are also some strange kind of curiosity objects displayed in the cases with the brains that give the whole thing a little bit of slightly more carnival atmosphere than I would like. But I gather that that's the way Cushing kept it himself. So the reason it's like that is that it's the way he did it.
Yeah, and I think that as we look at it in the era that he was doing this, we didn't talk about the same things that we talk about today. We didn't talk about the brain and the body and personal dignity and consent and all those issues. It was a different world.
Right.
And
he was using it, right? I mean, he was actually using the brains to look at and do as pathology samples.
These were all his patients.
They were part of a working collection.
Yeah. And you know, we have to go on the assumption that Cushing had very noble goals and noble intentions when he did this. I don't think it's too far a stretch to say that today there's a much different cultural, societal norm.
Yeah, I think that's true.
So,
that's why a lot of people, when they first go there, they're shocked by it, I think. It takes a while for them to get used to the atmosphere there and so on.
Absolutely. It brings up some really fascinating conversation.
So you've just made a move. You've gone back to Vermont.
I did.
So what's up with that?
So I moved to Burlington, Vermont, where I took a position at the University of Vermont, and I will be doing half clinical emergency medicine and half neuro ICU. So that's my clinical responsibility.
It's the same sort of split in the two areas that you had before.
Yes, it is. And it's exciting because it's where I went to medical school, so
Right.
I'm sort of coming back home. And we're building a new emergency medicine residency program, which we'll start interviewing for coming this fall.
And I imagine it will have an ethics component?
Absolutely it will. And we're also building a dedicated neuro ICU. So it's a great opportunity to use everything I've learned at Yale and build program in a new place.
Well, and we're very lucky that while you're in Vermont, you've managed to come back here to teach your seminar again for another summer.
I wouldn't miss it for the world.
Well,
I'm really grateful to be here.
Thank you very much, and thanks for sitting with me here for a minute.
Well, thank you very much, Steve.
My pleasure.
It's been my pleasure too.